Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's online talk, which is all about otters. Our speaker for this evening is Derek Crawley, and tonight's talk has been kindly organised and hosted by the Leicestershire and Rutland Badger Group. And tonight I'm joined by David Duckett and Dr. Pam Minot, who will be your hosts. If we have time at the end of the talk, we'll be hosting a short Q&A. So please do leave your Q&As, your questions in the Q&A box and your comments in the chat box, and we'll get through as many as we can. As always, we are delighted to host this talk for free, but if you would like to show some support or perhaps learn more about the Trust, you can do so by visiting our website, lrwt.org.uk. I'd also like to mention that if you are considering becoming a member of the Trust and showing some support, now is the perfect time to do so, as we're having a January sale, which means you can become a member from as little as £1.30 a month for the whole year. Okay, so that's all from me, and I'll now let the talk begin. So over to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. Good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Badger Group's first meeting for the new year. And I understand probably 90, approaching 100 of us are viewing, so that's excellent. As Jordan said, I am David Duckett. I think most of you, or many of you, know me. If you don't, I'm chairman of the Leicestershire and Rutland Badger Group. Do a plug for the Badger Group because we are affiliated to the Wildlife Trust. We're not actually a group of the Wildlife Trust in the same way as local groups. And as such, we have our own membership. And a plug here is we'd love to have more members. So if anybody wishes to be a member, please look at our website, badgergroup.org.uk, and please sign up and get details. Before we move on to tonight's talk, I just want to mention a little problem that's been occurring with regard to badgers, and that is the set blocking of badgers. Several cases have come to our fore in recent history, and this is where somebody has blocked all the holes of the set, preventing exit of badgers and potentially incarcerating them for good. Often badgers can get out through one hole, but badgers clearly die as a result of this awful business. And whilst I can't actually pinpoint the finger every time, we know that some of these are definitely being done by local fox hunting people. It's all illegal, totally illegal, blocking of sets. So what I'm asking is, when you guys are out in the countryside, if you see any incidents, please report them as a crime to the police. If they're not active on 101, report them, get an incident number, and having got that, let us, the local Badger Group, know, and we'll follow it through. Okay, thank you for that. So moving on to tonight's talk, I'm really very pleased to welcome Derek Crawley, who's, I think, now given something like 7 talks to our local group, most are face-to-face. Derek is an eminent mammologist, get the word out. He's Mammal Recorder for Shropshire, sorry, get the right county, Staffordshire. He's also very proactive in the Mammal Society. He came and gave a talk, well, he did a Zoom talk, in fact, from somewhere up in the northwest, I seem to remember, from a hotel room just over a year ago on the mole, which was really, really fascinating, fabulous. And if you haven't seen it, it's available on the Trust site on YouTube. And I do recommend that you go back and look if you've not seen that. The mole is a very elusive critter, and not many of us have actually seen live moles. Well, tonight he's also going to talk about a fairly elusive critter, the otter. So over to you, Derek.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen and then we can start from there.
Get rid of me.
Typically, I started in the wrong place, but there you go. So this is the otter. As David said, it's fairly elusive. It's not too bad at the moment. That's to say that quite a lot of people manage to see this animal quite local to them, since the otter is one of the success stories of conservation, and it has now repopulated virtually all of our main river systems in England, Wales and Scotland. So there's a good chance that you might have seen one recently because of this. My history with otters is one of first started looking for them and seeing them way back in about 1980, and I basically continue to watch a particular population of otters ever since on a fairly regular basis, although they did have a 10-year span when they were absent from the local area, but they came back on a natural rediscovery rather than it having to be a reintroduction. But the problem with otters is really quite a fun one. It's people get confused on what an otter is, and when you look at on newspapers and stuff, they'll quite often just take the first one that comes off Google Images and then don't always get it right. So occasionally we see this particular one, which isn't a European otter. If you look how large that nose is at the front, you can say, well, that's not quite right. Everything else looks about right. And this is actually a Canadian otter. If you want to look at the European otter, then it looks slightly different, but it is only slightly different. So it's a very easy mistake to make. They are very inquisitive animals. They want to know what's around. If they don't have many natural predators, basically dogs and wolves and stuff like that would have been the initial one. And therefore they are not particularly shy, and they can come quite close and just get on with their natural stuff without being too bothered whatsoever, especially when they have cubs. Quite often they will come very close to people and even fish right in front of people in town centres if the river runs through there. So again, this is the Canadian otter, slightly different, but it shows that same characteristics. This is one that gets easily confused, but also there are many other species of otters throughout the world showing that they're very successful animal within that. This is the largest one, which is the Amazonian Riverotter. It's a small one, will be about 2 meters 10, 2 meters 40, and they go bigger than that, but they tend to live in very localized family groups rather than being solitary. The other one that is quite often shown is the Asian shortclaw here, which is almost one of the smallest. This is the one that tends to be in most zoos because, again, it's a much more social animal and it displays much better and is seen much more frequently for visitors than if they've got European otters. And sometimes we actually find that we have got Asian shortclaws have been released into the wild in Britain before now, and there have been a small population knocking around the River Thames in Oxford for a couple of years, but we're not entirely certain whether they've now actually been they've actually died out and been replaced by the European otter or not. The sea otter is not that closely related, so it doesn't actually come from the same family as the European otter. It's completely different and has a different lifestyle, and it only is assumed to be an otter because of that cute face that goes with it. The sea otter in this country is exactly the same as the river otter. It's the European otter that just happens to exploit both those types of habitat. So going back to ours, this is the one we're seeing. It is very well adapted to living an aquatic lifestyle. You can see the webbed feet there. You can see the sleek body. Okay, but that sleek body is more down to its family group than anything else. And the family group is that of the weasels. And they all have this same characteristic body shape of a long, thin body with short legs and then a relatively long neck with a small head on top, and normally with a reasonably sized tail against its body length. So you have a quickly run through some of these. So you've got, this is the weasel, told apart from stoats by the fact it's got this jagged line of white on its chest, which actually gives weasels an individual characteristic. So we can actually look at individuals from that, down to the weasel, which is slightly bigger. So the weasel is about works out about 15 centimeters long, whereas the weasel goes up to about 15 to about 18 centimeters. And then you go up again towards polecats, still with this same body shape. And again, you can see on this one that the guard hairs, once they get a little bit wet, tend to stick together, which we'll see again within otters later. Similar size, but a better fur carrier is the mink. Then we go up to the pine marten, and now we're looking on something that's getting on to about 60, 70 centimeters long, head to tail, including the tail. The badger's still in the same group, and once you actually see how that body shape works, you can see that it is still part of that weasel family. And then we come back to the otter again, and size-wise, otters are bigger in length, but not in body weight than a badger. So we can argue which is actually sort of the biggest mustelid that we have in the UK. Now, here you can see on its neck, though, that jaggedy shape where the guard hairs have actually stuck together and given this quite dragon-like look on its neck. The underfur is relatively dry from all of this, and that's not too bad. But if the otter stays in the water for too long, then the fur will get waterlogged, and therefore that actually causes pneumonia, and they can die if they're actually kept in water for too long. The actual size of this animal, a small individual is about a metre head to tail, and that's about what most of the adult females are, or maybe a little bit longer than that. The males tend to be a little bit bigger, maybe by about 20%, but some of them are much bigger. So some of them have been recorded at about 1.80 meters, which is about 6 foot. So if it managed to actually balance on its tail, it will basically look me in the eye. And that's quite a daunting animal to come across. Personally, I've only seen them at about 5 foot. If I convert that over, it's about 1.40 meters or 1.50 meters. So it can be quite a sizable animal that goes with it. Distribution-wise, so here's where you can find otters, and most of that, the European otter actually takes up whole of Europe, and also a little bit across to on the Russian plains, etc. Most people expect them and see them as aquatic animals. You'll probably see your first otter in water. The number of times I've seen them on land is much less. They're all about the aquatic, and they, as I said before, that very happy within water. They're very agile within water, and they can look quite relaxed in water as well, but only for that brief second of the camera click, rather than it being a common pose to be upside down and enjoying yourself. So if we look for some of these special features that allows this, their eyes can see equally well in normal air as they can under clear water. They have whiskers, which are very important, because those whiskers actually help the animal to sense movement in water. So they work a little bit like the lateral line on a fish. So they know if, as a fish moves through the water, they can actually sense that movement and therefore move in that direction. And that's very important. There was an experiment done many years ago now, where they timed how long it would take an otter to catch a trout in a large tank, and if they put the animal in and with clear water, then it could catch that fish in 2 or 3 seconds without any problem whatsoever. If they then put ink in the water so that the eyes couldn't be used, then it could still find that fish in roughly the same sort of time by using its whiskers. They then did something which I don't agree with, but they then basically cut the whiskers off, and basically the otter couldn't find the fish, but in clear water the eyesight kicked in and the eyesight was used instead, with no effect of going through the water. You can see in this picture, you've got very small ears, so it's very streamlined body. They can close without a problem when they're underwater. And again, the nostrils close underwater as well. And you can see the webbing on the foot, 5 toes with webbing in between. So as they want to actually push their way through the water or swim through the water, it's these front paws that actually give them most of propulsion. With the back paws also being webbed, they can actually stick out like rudders and allow the animal to turn. And then the actual tail itself does a similar job. You can see that they've got quite long claws, and these are partly used for actually digging out holes. Well, they prefer not to dig out new ones. They tend to go into and enlarge rabbit burrows, or they go underneath the roots of trees that have been washed away by erosion with the water, and they can then just move some of the looser soil to try and make a better hole for them to actually use. But what the claws can be used for, and very effectively, is that can actually hold prey down and actually hold it against the ground or against the riverbed until the mouth can come into play and actually grab it from there. And again, here with this picture, you can see that they've got how wide those whiskers are. They definitely go beyond the size of the body. So again, as it's traveling through the water, they can actually use those as a sense to see whether or not they can actually fit through a hole, etc. This standing up on its back legs is quite important. It gives them that extra height to actually scan the surroundings and try to find either where a noise is, or to try and find something at a distance without being too near the ground. So when it comes to being in water, then they will quite often travel along the water just on the surface. Quite often you don't see the whole body as you do here. Quite often you see the head, then you have a bit of water over its shoulders, a little bit of sort of rear end, and then the tail follows on below. So you get like 3 different hits on it. But this picture basically shows you that they can travel along the surface of the water, stick their head in to try and locate fish and other prey, and then they will dive down to actually follow it. And then if they haven't caught it on that first instance, they will then resurface, relocate it, look down again, and off they go. Or they could just tip over and search the bottom using their whiskers and their feet to actually move prey items from in the mud and within the weed. If they can get their head through, generally they can get their body through. Although you can see it, the head is quite small. It does make trying to put collars on the animals to try and track them quite difficult, and they have to have a full body harness that actually fits over their front legs at the same time. The head width is important because it actually helps us work out between males and females. The male basically having a broader, flatter head than a more rounded than the female. Although quite often that can be, we can look at size for that more than anything else. Although that can get quite confusing when you've got several animals together, try to work out which is the male, which is the female, or whether or not you've got young and mother and everything else that goes with it. Generally speaking, if you see an otter out and about, you can't tell whether it's a male or female until you have that comparison with another one present. And then it's probably going to be down to size and size only. A lot of people assume it looks big, it's got to be a male, and you can't really tell until you have a closer look. Teeth-wise, you've got very similar to a dog, large canines, and then very angular teeth. It's not about chewing, it's about taking chunks off things and swallowing whole. The digestion is very quick. It takes about 2 or 3 hours for something like a fish to actually go through the system and come out the other end, but it's very efficient and basically just leaves bones behind as the non-digestible sections. Again, something that quite happens in a lot of species is when it opens its mouth wide, their eyes close. I still can't work out why that happens, but that's one of the things that goes with it. And the whiskers, again, here you can see they're actually bending down around the actual lower jaw, and that allows it to actually locate prey before it then shuts its mouth and captures it. And again, you can see that in this picture, where the whiskers are all coming around to feel where that food is. Okay, and you can see how the front paws with those claws are actually grasping this particular piece of, I think it's a piece of rabbit on this occasion, to go with it. You can see how the ears are actually blending in flat on the body. And they've got a little bit of marking on its nose, but that's about it. And again, it's just out the water. We've got this fairly spiky fur. Here we go again, another one. This one's just the paws are slightly away, but basically it's the same sort of thing in action that goes with it. And it tends to have this hunched up appearance when it's feeding. Paws are forward to actually grab hold of that food as it stands. And again, you can see here exactly that same, how the ones on the close muzzles are feeding down to where it is, but you need to also work out that at the back of the jaw, there are quite a few large vertebrae that when it opens its mouth and they come forward, it knows when the object is in its mouth and when to close its mouth. And we're finding more and more how important vertebrae are in, or the whiskers are within an awful lot of animals, and how well they use them. Now, I've tended to show you so far that basically it was fish that they were eating, and a little bit of maybe a little bit of rabbit. They are very active hunters above ground. They're not just dependent on riverways. And here you've actually got one that's actually turning over the soil to get at grubs and beetles within the topsoil, which it's quite happily eating as well. So they are very much the generalist eater, although you can argue they are specialists on anything aquatic. And individual otters have their own preferences, or seem to have their own preferences. Quite often for the otters that I watch, I've never really seen them take waterfowl, but I have found feathers in their droppings from anything from blue tip to blackbirds and starlings, but very few duck feathers that goes with it. But other places, again, I know that I've seen otters pull down coot and mallard from underneath without any issue whatsoever. It seems to be an individual preference thing. Now, hopefully, this should show you how they actually walk. And you can see there's one of two things here. You've got, this is a mother with a young cub, well, quite old cub now. You have this leaping bound with the high arch back and the tail held up high, which is fairly typical if they're moving quite quickly. But also at the back of that one, we'll show that again in a minute, how the cub was actually walking like a normal gait. It's got the much flatter back at a slower pace. It's doing it about, hasn't got that, doing it now. Okay, whereas the otter in the foreground has got this bounding gait that goes with it. So that can be important when you actually see this animal from the back, for the silhouette, for how it all actually pulls together. Once they've been in the water, then it's important that they maintain their status of their coat by getting out any trapped water from underneath the outer guard hairs, so they can keep their insulation. And they do this by basically rubbing themselves on a surface. So here it just happens to be a bit of grassy area from just outside of the water, and it's a case of you squash along and try to force the water out, which might include going sideways, upside down, to actually get as much out as you possibly can. And then once you've done this, it would then be down to actually some time to do it for grooming, before you then go to your rest area. So the grooming is very important, and again, this is where the claws come in. You can actually use those just like a comb and actually rake through what's happening within this. So we can look at how they maintain their fur within that. Now, I was very lucky recently to have watched an otter in and out of the sea for about 3 hours, and it would come ashore and dry itself off and have a bit of a rest, and then it went back in again. And right when it decided it was the end, it came onto this slightly bit of sandy beach. And as I said, you could see within this one, it's all about trying to squash itself against the sand to try and get as much of that water out. We found this very peculiar action that you'll see in just a minute of it. And there it goes with this trying to squash the stuff out from its chest by lifting its feet off the front. That's something we hadn't seen before. This particular animal is a male. You can clearly see that as he turns over there. He's quite big. We worked out him to about 4.5 foot long, head to tail. He's quite old. And unfortunately, he'd been in the wars against the prey items that he'd been doing, mostly lobsters, and he's got damage to his nose. He's got one of his eyes is half closed, but he was still hunting incredibly easily. Having gone through that process of drying off, he then disappeared and went into what we call a hover, which is a temporary halt, where they basically go to sleep. And they will sleep for an extended period of time. So you're looking on sort of an activity period of maybe 3 or 4 hours, and then they'll sleep for about 8 or 9 hours or something like that, and then have another activity to get some more food from that. And it all depends on how much food they need for how long they're going to be out and about for. They're not active all the way through the night, and they are quite often will come out during the day, depending on how much food they need, how much disturbance there is, and a whole range of other things. For where they actually need to go, then that is basically somewhere where they're not going to be disturbed. The main disturbance they're going to get is from people walking past them, and especially dogs. And dogs tend to be the disturbing factor that will actually move an otter on from an area. So where will you find otters? And the answer is basically virtually anywhere where there's water. Now, this view is of Leighton Moss looking down across Morecambe Bay. This is where I've been watching otters since about 1980, and they use the entire catchment here, which includes Leighton Moss, the side just off to the side where the water, some of the intake water comes in, which is known as Little Hawes Water, but they will also go out to the sea as well. And they have specific routes that they like to follow, and you can work these out for where you find their droppings, but you can also follow them as they go around, and you can see them at regular places. So it's easy to actually sit down and say, right, if I stay here, then an otter should come past me either today or tomorrow without any issues at all. And that's basically known as a lake-based system, which the otters behave differently to that you would find on a river system. So here's a nice river system, Lowland River, lots of wide, lots of good bankside cover. Depending on the quality of food available, that's the number of fish and how easy they are to catch, etc. Then here, the territory of an otter can be anything up to about 7 or 8 miles for a female and about 15 miles for a male. So if you wanted to sit on a bridge here and wait for the otter, that might be 4 or 5 or 6 days before you actually see it, because they tend to move along, use this stretch, use up all the fish, move down to the next section. Or they might decide to actually go to the other end of their territory on that single night and be able to get there without too much bother within a single traveling time, as it were, with a couple of breaks in between. On the lake system, because you tend to look at that as edge effect, you can actually get 2 or 3 animals will actually use that same area and actually share resources on a lake much more than you do within a river system. So again, this is upland rivers. The height of the river moves up and down very quickly. There's not an issue. There's still places that they can use for rest areas, and therefore there's still areas you can look at. Again, similar basis here. Much faster water, but still not a problem. Good at otter habitat. It's just trying to make sure that you can actually find them. Even on a smaller beck, and even as you go up these becks, it can come quite small. Basically, they will follow ditches. And we know that from watching how otters move around the ecosystem, they will go up a river and they will go up to quite a narrow stream, and there that might turn into a ditch that you wouldn't ever expect an otter to be on, and therefore that's the way they actually then cross from one catchment area to another. And when we actually look at some of the road casualties that we get, we can't work out how on earth the otter has decided to go there, because it doesn't seem to be any river system that they're following apart from these ditches. So a variety of different areas, all plenty of water, all good cover that goes with it. And if you move up onto the coastal areas, then again, they are treated very much more like lakes. They have a little bit of overlap on their territories within this. You have several otters actually using that area, but there are some exclusivities on a much smaller area, especially when it comes down to the females. They'll have a smaller stretch that they will follow. Because the tide comes in, it replenishes the food on a regular basis. And therefore that makes it slightly easier to see. And sometimes we find that rather than the animals being nocturnal, they actually follow a tide cycle, and therefore there are certain stage of the tide where you're more likely to see an otter. It's not a guarantee, it just seems to be what happens, but you can normally see an otter at any time. Middle of the day isn't a problem, and never has been. So again, ideal conditions to watch otters because it's absolutely flat as a pancake. You'll see any disturbance, which makes them a lot easier to actually pick up as they move through, and you will get that typical ring of bright water. But having said that, rougher seas aren't a problem. They can manage to go through the waves without an issue, although the young animals do then have a problem quite often. If they're not strong enough swimmers, then they will actually get separated from parents at this stage, and mortality can follow because of the rough weather. One thing that they need on a coastal system is fresh water, because they've got to get the salts out of their fur, and therefore it's the fresh water that gives them that bath that allows them to keep their coat in a much better condition. So if you're on the coast, go look to where the fresh water is. That's where you'll find the droppings. That's where you'll know you're starting to get your territories, and then you can move down from there. So when it comes down to trying to find otters, if you're going to sit down and watch them, then you've got to look for field signs. Although some people reckon this is me taking a pee, it's not. This is me looking for poo. So we're looking for otter spraint. This is their droppings that they leave behind. It works as a means of getting rid of the nasty stuff. But every time they do poo, they put out a secretion that tells other otters whether they're male or female and what part of the sexual cycle that they're actually in. So they advertise the fact that they've gone past and it's there and it's saying, this is my territory, or it might be saying, I'm a young female and I'm looking for a mate, or it might say that I'm a female and I've got young, and therefore it's their way of communicating. And they come in all peculiar places. Normally you expect to see something at eye level for an otter. So sitting on top of this branch isn't where we'd normally expect to find otter spraint. This is otter spraint. I'm afraid I'm a mammologist, therefore I think of poo as a good thing, something that you want to look at in detail and something you want to pick up and smell. For otters, it's a pleasant smell. They say it's new mown hay or jasmine tea. And when you pick it up, you normally get little bones of fish sticking into your fingers. So you've got an idea that, yes, there's definitely fish bones in there. That's either going to be otter or it's possibly going to be mink, but the smell will make the difference. The sweet stuff is the otter. The bad stuff that will actually clear your nasal passages is the mink. And we can actually tell an awful lot from what the otter's been eating. You can put this in a little glass petri dish, add a sterodent tablet to get rid of all the organic matter that will dissolve. That will leave behind the bones, and then you can then work out what fish they've been eating, what other things they've been eating, and also down to species level that goes with it. In this particular one, you can probably see there's a little muscle casing just here, plus you can definitely see that's a nice little backbone vertebrae in the middle of that one. But otter spraint doesn't come as the book suggests, like that one. That was a classic book spraint. Now this one's completely different. This is falling apart. It's got an awful lot of what we call anal jelly in it, a lot of liquid, very much different, but it still has that characteristic smell. So it's still a case of get down on your hands and knees and stick your nose in it. And again, this one's now got a totally different color. They've got a gray one, much smaller. This is about the size of a 10p piece. But again, it's still got that smell and it still shows us where the otter's been. Here's another one that's got some crustacean shells in it, but most of it is this little bubbly form. That isn't going to last very long. That's only going to last a couple of hours until it dries out and the evidence has disappeared. I have to admit, I found this one relatively easily because I saw the otter do it, and therefore I could rush in and have my my fix of otter spraint without any issues whatsoever. This one has actually got the eggs of salmonoids in it, so it's either, I think it's trout eggs. And one of the worries that a lot of fishermen have is that when fish have spawned, they're quite they're very tired, and that makes them easy prey for otters. And there are certain times when you find specific species come into the otter's diet, because that's when those animals are a little bit more lethargic and therefore easier to catch at that time. Generally, it should be said that otters will go for the easy food, so it's going to be the sick and the slow rather than the really fast ones. I definitely put too much poo in the talk. I can sell that. It's one of my bad habits. I know I ought to apologise, but it's just all the different forms that you can come across that goes with it. And I can't apologise enough for that, but that's just me. Where they put them is very much sort of on the otter's eye view. So that rock to the left of the picture is fairly typical, because as the otter comes up or downstream, it's in the way. It's the spraint's going to stay there for some time, and it's going to be advertising for the next 3 or 4 weeks without a problem. Also on the as the roots come down, that's another area that sticks out as you travel up and down. So that'd be another place you'd actually look for those droppings. And here you've got them. That's just, again, all jelly that goes with it. Underneath bridges is another good area. And although here you've got a variety of different rocks, the otters have always got somewhere they can put their spraint, regardless of how high or low that particular river goes. and therefore it's an easy one. And underneath the bridge themselves, you tend to find, let's have a look, like this one, underneath on that ledge, you can have a history of spraints going back to some that were 2 or 3 months old, because they're protected from the elements, so therefore they stay longer, and you can then work out whether your otter spraint that you're finding is fresh, in other words it's still wet, whether it's new, so it's dried out but it's still got that black texture, whether it's old, it's starting to actually fall apart and turning grey, and then very old when basically it's virtually disappeared. And you can therefore, from a single visit, you can work out how often the otters comes to these locations and how important this is to actually advertise the what otters are doing in that region. To go with these areas, quite often you have mud associated with them. So in order to get up to the top to actually spraint, so that spraint doesn't disappear, you might be able to find footprints. And the footprints then help you try to work out the size of the otter, but also looking at whether or not there are cubs in the area. So this is still looking at Leighton Moss, and this is basically showing you there's a little bridge here, just in the middle of the picture, and it separates the 2 different bits of water down the main causeway. Even though the otters can swim underneath the bridge, they actually come out and spraint and then walk across the path and then re-enter the water, because there are very few places on a lake system where they can actually have this communication. So this becomes quite an integral part of how they communicate and how you can find evidence of them. And again, this is just more spraint just on the top of that rock there. And again, occasionally you get very excited people who find an awful lot of otter spraint over a number of periods, and just how obvious it is when you're there. And this is my particular mammal group, but there's always people interested in finding out more about different animals throughout their regions. Now, we've said in the past that the otters have got 5 toes, and here you can see footprints clearly with 5 different toes showing. The webbing's not very clear, but you can also see prints, again, slightly top right, that the print going up the page has clearly got 5 toes, but the one coming down has only got 4, but it's still an otter's print. You tend to have this quite wide toe spacing, much bigger footprints than you'd expect for the size of animal, but that's because it's got the wide toes to allow it to actually have the webbing between it and actually then thrust through the water. And you can then follow these as they go along the banks and work out whether or not they're actually sprinting or whether they're just merely coming on to walk through. On sometimes you might be lucky enough to have an area where they actually stop and have brought on prey, and therefore you can actually eat it from there. So it gives you some indication of the animal that's in the area before you actually have to sit down and try and watch it. That large protrusion coming through the mud here is actually a surface tunnel for a mole, but that's a different talk, as you've already heard. So here's a quite nice 5-toe print. You can't see the webbing in between. It all depends on the substrate, on how soft it is, to whether or not the print actually stays. If you look just above the 50p coin, you can just about make out that second step that goes with it, where you can see 5 toes, but it's a lot older, and it's also got debris in where the toes are and the actual main heel of the animal. Slightly better, but again only 4 toes showing, but it's that breadth that actually makes the difference. And it's just as always with all of these things, it's getting your eye in to work out what's actually there and which animal it actually is that goes with it. So there's a much better one, and here you can see the animal is actually gone into that looping walk where the actual toes, the feet of one overshadows the second one. So as they go along, they're covering the same footprint again and again, which makes it a slightly different, but you can work out the gait, how fast the animal's traveling at this point. Sand, similar basis. And here's the interesting one. You've got an otter going up the left-hand side of the page, but you've got mink, again 5 toes, coming down towards us on the right-hand side. And you can see the size difference between the two animals here without any issue whatsoever. And therefore, looking for the tracks is quite important when you're trying to work out if an animal is present or not, and also what they're actually going, which direction they're traveling in. Snow can quite useful, but here's a definite warning. The snow here is over water, and as the animal went about its route, it's actually walking on top of the ice, which isn't a problem. But if you're silly, like some people who might be talking, then you will get quite excited and want to go out and have a look at this. But I have fallen through the ice on at least 2 occasions. Luckily not into very deep water, but it's not a good practice to do. And you're much better off not trying to follow otters where they go across a wetland habitat. But here it wasn't too bad because this was just a ditch, although the ditch was about sort of knee deep when I fell through. And it's then rather cold going home afterwards. But you can see here the otter was actually spending a lot of time walking along, looking in different directions, trying to find some food in this very awkward time for it, where everything is actually underwater and snow and held out. So once again, it's looking at the information that this animal can find. So here we are smelling somebody else's spraint, working out what's there, and then once they've done that, they then deposit their own. And they say, this is my message, and then they'll go on their way. Generally, we tend to find if they're crossing a path or going up through a bridge, as they come out of the water, they tend to spraint and then they go on. So you get an idea of which direction they're going on from just the spraint itself. And again, here's another one having a poo, and you can see it's very typical tail up. So again, as a indication of what it's doing, you can soon work out where they're sprainting, and therefore you know next time you're out and about whether or not you can actually check out that area. When I first started looking for otters way back in the 70s, there weren't very many about. I think I had one early record for Middlesex reported to me from about 1950. Then the animal seems to disappear from my my home area. And it wasn't until the 1980s that I saw my first otter and my first otter spraint and stuff like that. Part of the reason for that is down to the poisons that we were using in the environment at the time. Now, you all might be familiar with something called DDT, which was a chemical used in the environment which has an effect on the egg thickness of various birds of prey and other top predators. For the otter, it was a similar chemical known as Dereldrin or DDD, and that was used not only as a sheep dip, as can be seen here, but also as a seed dressing. And what happened in this situation is the sheep came in, they were dipped into this solution with that chemical in it. Then after all the sheep had been dipped, and that actually killed off the fly strike and the maggots in their fur, then all that water would be flushed down into the river system. And then that would kill off a variety of invertebrates. And then from the invertebrates, it would go into the fish, and then the otter ate the fish. The stuff doesn't biodegrade, it stays in their body. And as you build up the levels of toxins, it didn't kill the otter outright, the same as it didn't kill the birds of prey outright. It affected what we call its fecundity, which is its ability to breed. So basically it made them sterile, and that, along with other issues, then made otters quite rare. Now, this is called a Fike Net. This is used for catching eels. They are still in existence, they are still used, but these days they have to put what's called an otter guard onto them, but they didn't used to, and it used to basically, an otter would go in to get the fish inside, couldn't get back out, and therefore it was trapped underwater. If it could rise to the surface, it was just too wet, and eventually it would either die of lack of oxygen and drown, or it would die from pneumonia. And then because at this stage the otters weren't protected, you just basically took the otter out, threw it to the side, and went on with your normal business. But we got to the stage where otters were becoming quite rare, that any individual that was taken out had an effect over the overall population. Road casualties are still an issue, and it's a definite issue when it comes down to taking out males, because the male might be covering 3 or 4 females in a stretch of river, and if you take him out, you've got to worry whether there's another one that's actually going to be available to take over that space. The males are very territorial, they will chase out other males from their territory, and therefore it can take some time for the population to re-establish a male in their area that goes with it. Now that otter was probably killed, this is the A66 in the Lake District, and just where that car is at the top of this bridge, there was an otter killed there for about a 5-year period, an otter a year, and that was having a major effect on the otters there. So the Environment Agency worked out this method of actually fencing off the bridge, because as the water level came up, it came too fast through underneath the bridge, and the otters would then climb out, walk over the road, get run over before they get down the other side. So by blocking off their access to the road, but they wanted the otters to be able to travel past the bridge, they put in this ledge that you can see on both the left and the right side, which was above the main water level of flood conditions. So the otters can basically walk underneath this ledge and therefore get from one side of the road, other side of the road quite safely. And that made a big difference. And we found spraints onto this this platform on a regular basis, so we know that they were using them even when the river was quite low, as it is in this picture. Other mitigation that you can put in, back in Staffordshire, we had a problem of a blind corner where wildlife was regularly getting killed. We were worried that otters, which were using both sides of the road, would be one of those casualties. So we found this culvert where the water was going underneath the road, and we basically blocked off one side to stop the water coming through. We laid the hedge, we put in a fence, and we then ensured that the otters could come through that culvert to get from one side to the other. So there's the dry side and the wet side on the top end, and there's on the bottom side. Didn't quite solve the problem. It had to get a little bit more ingenious because there was quite a slope between those two different sides. So therefore, to help an otter actually climb up through the pipe and other wildlife, we actually tied together or sewed together a number of strips of astroturf so they could actually get a grip and go through. And then we put an otter halt down the bottom to actually give them somewhere to use as rest areas on this otherwise very barren sided river. We knew the otters were going up and down the river on a fairly frequent basis, but there weren't that many places where they could actually rest up. So we built a chambered halt, covered it over, and we found otters that were using that very quickly within about 2 months of us putting it in. We've done stick pile halts on a similar basis. They don't last quite as long, but are cheaper to make. And underneath that rotting pile of a habitat pile there's an otter halt, and again that one was used within about 2 months of the period of putting in. Got a little bit more to go. I hope that's all right time wise. When it comes down to breeding, well, we ought to say that generally the European otter is solitary. Once a male comes across the spraint of a fertile female, he will then pursue her. they will meet, they will potentially fight in the water to try and get that dominance that goes with it. He will try to stick with her until she's ready to mate. That will involve an awful lot of rough and tumble. Some people call it play, but there's quite a lot of biting that goes on within this lot to try and work out whether she's ready at that point or not. And then basically 60 days later, the young are born. That can be at any time of the year. We have records of births every month of the year, regardless of the weather. There's no delayed implantation. She has normally 2, can be up to 4, or it can be a single, and they're out. And this is where quite often we get orphan otter cubs taken into captivity and helped, because if they're born in the winter, in rough waters, in high flood waters, then quite often the young animals can be separated from mother and therefore need our assistance. Initially, they are born blind, and therefore they are totally dependent on mother, but they soon open their eyes and move away onto solids after about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. But they actually stay with mother for about at least 12 months, but quite often up to about 14 months. And it's not until about 18 months that they probably go their separate ways. So you get an awful lot of time and an awful lot of care with that female, teaching them what's in their habitat, where the best food is, how to hunt, how to swim initially, for them to actually get used to it. And eventually she leaves them after about a year, and then she becomes fertile again. And at that point, the male will try to cover her again. The 2 individuals or 3 individuals will then stay as a loose adolescent pair, sometimes being seen together, sometimes being seen singularly, until eventually, normally the male leaves and goes off, because the dog otter will actually chase him out of the territory once he gets to a maturity stage. When there are young about, as I say, mother is then looking after, and this is probably mother on the right and a youngster on the left. It's difficult to tell. Then it comes down with they are seen more often, because there are more and more fishing trips, there are more and more time when they're young to need to have that additional food. Here, the 2 fairly grown otters on the sea. The one underneath is the actual cub, although it is basically the same size as mother. And mother's on top and giving that protection. And it's just trying to work out the ins and outs of how this all works. But again, because they're looking directly at camera, they're aware of the photographer, and there's a little bit of disturbance going on. And people really need to use the larger lenses to try and make sure that you don't have that disturbance, or you're somewhere where they are used to people, and it moves through from there. When I first started all of this, if people said they saw a otter on the river in the 80s, then it was probably a mink. Nowadays, if they say I see an otter, I'm more likely to believe them. Mink are still out there, but they are fewer, and they are having to compete with the river space with otters. And because an otter is basically, well, a mink is about 60 centimeters long, an otter is about 1 meter, the otter's going to win any confrontation at that stage. It's only when there are young about there's going to be issues, to such an extent that the mink have actually changed the way that they behave on rivers. And quite often we think they've actually moved out of rivers and gone on to hedgerows away from rivers, or they've gone to be more diurnal than nocturnal, as the otter's actually taken over that nocturnal time to go with it. But generally there are less mink about the place. On the whole, as you see a mink in water, the whole body will be above water. That's head, body and tail all at once will be seen within that, whereas the otter tends to be this head, back tail, back rump if you like, and tail when it moves through. The otter will dive more frequently, but that's, again, it's very much subjective to what the animals are doing at that time. But there is a big difference in size to look at. And again, here's fairly typical. The shoulders again underwater, and you've got the head, the rump, and the tail that's on view. If you're going out to watch for an otter, then you've got various things on your side. And because the otter is a top predator, a lot of other species don't like it, especially gulls, black-headed gulls in this instance, and they behave in different ways to show their displeasure. So if there's a heron about, like in this picture, then the gulls will actually hover directly above it, but dive bomb it on a fairly regular basis. Whereas if it's an otter or a human, they just tend to circle above. So you can tell from a distance roughly what that predator is from their behavior. Not always the case. I have seen gulls actually dive bomb otters just to prove me wrong, but that's just the way it is. So here you can see there's an otter with a very clear wake going behind the island, and the gulls above it are well above it, but they actually are circling the point where the otter is. The ducks in the foreground have basically got their heads up. They're a little bit worried because they know that something's going on about it, but you can follow that animal as it moves across the water quite easily. Depending on when you're seeing things, I tend to see them mostly dawn and dusk. Then you can get different activities. So here you've got an animal that's actually hunting quite frequently in just a little bit of iced water. You can see it's fairly shallow because oh look, there's two otters. That's just to confuse you. There's a gull going over the top from reflection. You can see as it dives down, it's got tail up. There's the gulls not really wanting to get too close. And you get the fairly typical movement through the water. Oops. That goes with it. It can be difficult at times to try and work out how many otters you have got because you don't see them above the surface for that long. So there's one, there's two. Oh, they both disappeared again. Oh, there's another one. So that's one, that's two. So there's only two there. They're both underwater again at the moment. Okay, but there actually was mum and two cubs in that shot, just to show you how difficult it can be. This one shows you the third one. Shows I can't keep a steady hand as well, and how many other people were actually in the public in the hide when this was all happening. This was another occasion where we had ice over the water to such an extent that you can almost walk on the ice, but not quite. You can see they're just falling through. And as they dive down, they've then got to basically headbutt the ice in order to actually get a breath of air. Here you have two youngsters fighting over an eel, and you can see she's a little bit upset that she just lost it. So she'll go off hunting on her own. And it's only because I watch these otters on a regular basis that I know basically who's who within this. Normally you'd assume that that was a female and the other one's a cub of a nondescript sex who's stolen the food that goes through. I have to say that this clip was totally dark. I tend to go to watch the otters about an hour before it gets light, so I can get a feel for the area. And sometimes you can get lucky with things like this, and sometimes you see nothing at all until later. That was a bat just going across the area as well. What are we on to? So there's a lot I haven't talked about, I'm sure, and I can see that there are a variety of questions in both the chat and the question and answer. All I will say is, for myself, for watching otters at Leighton Moss, dawn and dusk are the best time. But having said that, I've got records of otters every single hour of the day and night where otters have been seen. If you want to have an almost guaranteed chance of seeing otters, then I would suggest Leighton Moss is the one. But even locally to where you are, there will be local rivers where otters will be seen. Follow the Facebook pages, because as soon as mum's got a couple of young with them, they tend to come out much more during the day. So I'll stop at that point and look at some of your
Okay, Derek, thank you very much. As usual, a very fascinating talk full of lots of information. Pam Minot, my colleague, is going to ask some of the questions and I'll assist. And if you think we're missing them out, you pick them up. But there are quite a few, so we're trying to expedite them.
That's fine.
Pam, if you can kick off, if you're there.
Yes, I've had quite a few questions about mink and otters. Someone asked how to tell, John Wilkie asked how to tell an otter from a mink print.
Basically, the main thing is size. The mink has a much more pointy face than an otter. It has a much more sort of flatter face if you see them within that. Their general gait as they move about on land is very similar because they're both in the same family. Size tends to be the biggest thing. Most otters have an awful lot more white underneath their chin and down their chest, whereas most mink tend to just have a white spot on them. The mink tend to be a little bit more spiky as they come out of the water in their fur than otters, which tend to be have it, but not quite to the same extent. And the actual, if you can get a view of the tail, an otter's tail is very much longer than that of in comparison to the body, as opposed to the mink, which is about sort of a third of the size rather than about the same.
Another question again about otters and mink. Why are otters seen less damaging? This is from Leslie. Why are otters seen less damaging to the ecosystem than mink?
Because otters are a native to the country, all the other species have learned to coexist with it, whereas the mink, being non-native, hasn't, and also because of the size of the mink, they've caused problems going into things like watervole tunnels. So if you've got watervoles and otters, the watervole simply disappears down its tunnel and that's the end of it. Whereas female mink can actually enter the tunnels of watervoles and therefore there's no escape for them. And a lot of watervoles are having to move into marshland areas to try and escape mink and being found by mink within that one. And again, it comes down to the otters. They take mostly fish, to be honest, whereas the mink take mostly reptarian water-based birds. So they'll take out your coot chicks, your chook eggs, as well as mallards, etc. Whereas on the whole, you don't tend to find that with otters. They might take one or two, but they're not specialists within that. But it's basically that problem of non-native against native.
Again, will otters fight mink? And that's from Alan Penter.
They will. So if they come face to face, then the otter will actually kill a mink because of the competition factor. But generally, what we found is that mink are actually now avoiding otters as much as they can. And sometimes with just if there's a lot of spraint about, then that quite often can put a mink off. Mink tend to be more mobile, more mobile rather than having a set territory until they've got young, the female's got young when she tends to stay put. They tend to travel up and down, whereas the otter has a definite territory and it will keep other animals out of that territory.
Thanks. And from my namesake Pam, is pollution and plastic waste causing problems for otters?
We know that we recently did some work with Staffordshire University. We're looking at microplastics in otters' brains, and they're definitely there. We don't as yet know the full extent that will have, and whether or not it's actually having an effect on their bodies. That's something that Cardiff University is looking into, looking at from otter carcass point of view, from roadkill. But there will be problems over the amount of larger bits of plastic that they actually, well, there's two. One, they can get caught up in bits of plastic, and that will cause problems in their mobility. But the second one, they actually play with the stuff. They will actually use it like a float, and they will actually juggle it.
I'll just come in there and add, Duncan Ball has asked about the comment really on pollution that the Environment Agency are looking at or not looking at. So pollution other than plastic, sewage mainly.
Yes, it has an effect. Anything that affects the fish population is there, and that's where they take most of these chemicals in from it. If it's raw sewage, then that'll have an effect on what's called the biological demand, which takes out fish, and therefore has a knock-on effect within that. There's not too much. They will swim in dirty rivers, but if they ingest, that will be a problem within that for the pathogens. But most of it comes down to affecting the quality of the ecosystem, and the not having enough fish. Otters will supplement that by going onto land and actually taking young rabbits, birds, and as I said, going through and looking for beetles in soil and stuff like that. So they're quite a generalist, and it shouldn't be it is an issue. We need to clear up our rivers, but they'll survive quite nicely as it stands.
A question from Jane: how can we help to support otters?
It's making sure that they've actually got places to rest up. So if you've got a river system that doesn't have any cover what they can go into, so that might be a bramble patch, that might be a small bit of woodland where people don't have access, that's where the issues tend to be at the moment. Quite often when it comes down to breeding, they'll actually move off the main rivers and go down to really quite small streams that you wouldn't imagine an otter's going to be on. But if you have too much disturbance, especially from dog walkers, then that'll actually move the otter on from there.
A question from myself: how far can otters travel overland? I'm asking this because we actually we live in the suburbs, and we had an otter going to next door but one's garden, and there was a brook running at the bottom of the garden, but that was a long way from any other water courses.
They will go miles overland. I was recently in Wales, and I found a dead otter on the road, which we sent to Cardiff University, and that was the nearest stream river was about 2 miles, and this was halfway up a mountainside. So we can't work. It looked like it was actually going uphill rather than down. But they will travel overland in order to get from one catchment to another, from one river to another. And some of the streams that they'll go through are quite small. Thanks. I've known an otter. Well, we think we worked out an otter went about 10 miles over an evening period.
Good heavens.
Pam, I think I'll step in there. I think we probably have one last question because time is going on and a number of people are falling away. I think we want to wind up now. You've obviously, Derek, generated lots of interest with questions pouring in. So last one is from Helen O'Brien. Have you used wildlife cameras fairly successfully to capture otter activity in areas previously unrecorded?
Not previously unrecorded. I tend to use them in areas where I know. I've used them at Leighton Moss quite frequently to try and work out which sex of animals actually going past. The issue you have with cameras and otters used to be as most of the cameras work on a temperature variation, and as the otters come out of the water, they're actually colder than the surrounding air, and that doesn't tend to trick the camera off quite so easily. If you do put them out, then I would suggest underneath bridges for your ease of actually getting there, and try to get it so that you get the animal walking towards the camera rather than across it, and that makes a difference to actually getting pictures within that. I did once manage to persuade my local town council to lend me one of their crime prevention CCTV cameras, and they were really quite useful to find out exactly how often they were going through underneath a certain bridge. So that was very useful. So it's a case most of the time of security of your camera is the issue if you're going to leave it out for any length of time.
Okay, thank you, Derek. You've obviously generated a huge amount of interest tonight, as you usually do. Apologies to those who have asked questions and they haven't been answered. Some of them have been answered in the talk, I see. And thanks very much. So there's a lot of good comments about the talk. So can I add to those and say thank you very much for a very, very stimulating and interesting talk. And I'll give you an applause from everybody. And thank you, Pam, for your assistance. Pam's joining the applause. And I'll pass you over now pass over to Jordan to tie up the event, which has been very successul. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Derek, as well, for a really informative talk. It's a pleasure to have you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As everyone's mentioned, there's lots of questions. If you do have any more that you want to get answered, please do email them in and I'll pass them over to the team. So a few things from me. We will be hearing from Pam in the near future with another talk hosted by the Badger Group, and that's going to be on February 10th over Zoom, and it's all about whales, dolphins and porpoises, and that'll be followed by a short AGM as well. You will all be receiving a survey email in the next couple of days, which will give you a link to book your ticket there, and also get some see the new talks for spring season as well. Once again, thank you. If you would like to show some support or perhaps become a member, please do so by visiting our website. There's lots of information there. We're always here to answer your questions. And once again, thank you, Derek, thank you, David, thank you, Pam. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all in the near future. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.